Well, we're your election headquarters, and it is an election night that will go down in the history books in DeSoto County. The Mississippi special election yesterday wasn't just another vote. It was the first time voters cast ballots in a newly created majority black Senate district ordered by a federal court. WRG's Alice Coleman talked with one of the winners who made history.
The Supreme Court's decision to effectively gut the effects test of the Voting Rights Act has set off alarm bells across the political landscape, and the immediate consequences are already beginning to take shape. The first and most visible sign of what is coming can be seen in Republican-controlled southern states, where lawmakers are already moving to target the congressional districts that Black Americans represent. In Mississippi, Governor Tate Reeves has already called for eliminating the only majority black House district in the state, which is remarkable given that Mississippi is one of the blackest states in the entire nation. Observers and analysts who follow voting rights issues closely expect similar moves to follow in other southern states in the days and weeks ahead.
In DeSoto County, Mississippi, the votes have been counted. For Democrat Teresa Gillespie Isom, her decisive Senate victory was personal and historic.
Yes, it was history being made. First African-American senator, as well as the first female senator in DeSoto County. So it was history.
This election followed court-ordered redistricting.
This is not a minor procedural skirmish. It is a deliberate and calculated political strategy with deep historical roots. And understanding those roots is essential to grasping the full weight of what is happening right now. To appreciate the severity of the situation, it helps to go back not centuries, but just decades. In 1970, Louisiana, Georgia, and Mississippi had no black representatives in Congress whatsoever. This was not because black voters did not exist in those states.
Voters in a newly created majority black Mississippi Senate district made their voices heard, electing Isom, who captured 63% of the vote, over Republican Charlie Hoots's 37%.
It means that we have had the opportunity now to make sure that the people in DeSoto County have a voice that's a Democratic voice, not that all seats in DeSoto County are Republican.
In Mississippi alone, black residents made up approximately 35% of the total population. The absence of black representation was not an accident. It was the predictable result of systematic voter suppression, discriminatory districting practices, and a political culture that had for generations worked to ensure that black voices carried no weight in the halls of power. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 began to change that, but it was the 1982 amendments to the act that truly transformed the legal landscape.
This year, it was a fierce competition for a Senate majority, and it came down to just a handful of seats. The next big thing that Republican senators will do is elect the next majority leader in a secret ballot. It's a big decision because this is turning the page on the Mitch McConnell era in the Senate. The Kentucky Republican has had the longest leadership run in Senate history. The Senate plays a really important role in confirming the president's cabinet. For some of those national security positions, the Senate usually confirms them right after the presidential inauguration on January 20th. The Senate also plays a really important role for judicial nominations, and that will become really clear if there's a vacancy on the U.S. Supreme Court.
Those amendments introduced what is known as the effects test, which allowed courts and advocates to challenge voting practices, not only when there was direct and explicit evidence of racist intent, but also when those practices produced discriminatory effects regardless of intent. The reasoning behind this change was straightforward and practical. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, southern jurisdictions had learned how to game the system.
Mississippi Senate Democrats celebrated their efforts to gain 2 more seats.
The momentum that you saw last night was about the power that we have in representing our communities.
According to data from Senator David Blunt, Teresa Isom flipped the seat in District 2 with 63% of the vote.
They had become sophisticated enough to avoid going on the record with explicitly racist justifications for their policies. They could achieve the same discriminatory outcomes through ostensibly neutral means, through at-large voting systems, through strategic annexations, through the drawing of district lines that packed or cracked black communities in ways that diluted their political power. The effects test was designed to cut through that kind of sophisticated discrimination and allow advocates to challenge outcomes rather than having to prove intent. The 1982 amendments passed on a bipartisan basis in Congress. They were not a fringe or radical idea, at least not to most Americans.
The victory that we are celebrating today is certainly a direct result of the federal courts here in Mississippi ruling that the district lines needed to be redrawn.
Senator Daniel Sparks says he's not in favor of the districts being drawn by the courts.
That's not something that I prefer. I believe the legislature should have the job of doing that. It obviously changes the dynamic when you look at voting populations and districts that you run in.
Sparks says Republicans plan to work with all new members to keep Mississippi moving forward. At the state capitol, Cameron Smith, 12 News.
Now, Democrats now hold 18 of the 52 seats in the state Senate. Republicans hold 34, which is less than the 2/3 majority needed to ram through legislation without bipartisan support. The Mississippi Republican Party called last night's results disappointing, but not unexpected. In a statement, party chairman Mike Hurst said, quote, "The Democrats' wins yesterday were the equivalent of scoring points in the fourth quarter while losing the game in a blowout. It doesn't change the conservative direction or policies in our state legislature," end quote.
Democrats are celebrating the momentum while Republicans are downplaying its overall impact. I believe we're going to have close votes on several measures, and certainly when we come to money bills, those bills that require 3/5 votes and suspension resolutions or constitutional amendments that require 2/3 votes, the victory that we achieved last night and the momentum we are expressing today will be critical. While you may not have a super majority, you just expect to do super work. So I think if we have good policies, good positions, and we have bipartisan support for those, you don't have to worry about what the number is. But they were deeply controversial in certain legal and political circles. And one of the most prominent opponents of those amendments was a young lawyer working in the Department of Justice at the time. That lawyer was John Roberts, who is now the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Roberts was by several accounts the point person in the Reagan administration's effort to defeat the 1982 amendments. The recent Supreme Court decision in Louisiana effectively killed the last remaining provision of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It was authored by Justice Samuel Alito, but it represents the life's work of Chief Justice John Roberts. The Roberts Court has now gutted the Voting Rights Act on 3 different occasions, and Roberts wrote or joined every one of those opinions. He wrote memos and argued internally that the amendments represented what he called a radical experiment in electoral engineering. He fought against them. He lost that fight in 1982, and the amendments became law. But Roberts never abandoned his fundamental skepticism about the effects test and the broader framework it represented. It has taken him more than 4 decades, but the Supreme Court he now leads has finally delivered what he and other like-minded legal conservatives have long sought, which is the effective dismantling of the legal standard that made modern Voting Rights Act enforcement possible. The court has been careful in its language. The justices have not said outright that they are striking down the 1982 amendments. They will insist in their opinions and in public statements that the Voting Rights Act remains intact. But legal scholars and civil rights advocates are nearly unanimous in their assessment that what the court has done is functionally equivalent to gutting the law. By eliminating or severely narrowing the effects test, the court has made it extraordinarily difficult for plaintiffs to challenge discriminatory voting practices. Without the ability to prove discrimination through outcomes, advocates are left trying to prove discriminatory intent, which is precisely the evidentiary bar that the 1982 amendments were designed to lower. The court has in effect turned back the clock to the legal landscape that made those amendments necessary in the first place. There is another aspect of the court's behavior that deserves attention beyond the immediate policy implications, and that is the question of judicial process and institutional integrity. The specific question that the Supreme Court ruled on in this case was not even a question that the parties in the litigation were actively contesting. The court raised it on its own, essentially reaching out to find an opportunity to address an issue that the justices, or at least a majority of them, had long wanted to revisit. This kind of judicial activism from the bench is precisely the kind of behavior that the court's conservative members have historically criticized when they believed it was coming from liberal justices. The majority also ran roughshod over its own recent precedents, including decisions handed down just a few years ago in order to reach its preferred outcome. The intellectual contortions required to reconcile the current ruling with those recent precedents are considerable, and the majority's attempts to explain away those earlier decisions have not been particularly convincing to legal observers across the ideological spectrum. This is important context for anyone trying to understand how to respond to the court's current direction. When people talk about Supreme Court reform, the conversation is sometimes framed in purely partisan terms, as if the only objection to the current court is that its ideological composition does not align with progressive preferences. But the case for reform rests on something more than ideology. It rests on a documented pattern of behavior in which the current majority has been willing to override Congress, to ignore precedent, and to reach beyond the questions actually presented in cases before it in order to achieve desired policy outcomes. A Congress that has written a law on a bipartisan basis, as was the case with the 1982 Voting Rights Act amendments, should be able to expect that its work will be respected by the courts. When the courts instead rewrite statutes they find inconvenient, that is a problem that goes beyond any particular policy outcome. The practical consequences of all this will extend far beyond congressional districts. The redistricting fights that are coming in the wake of this decision will play out at every level of American government. City council districts, county commission districts, judicial election districts, school board districts, all of these are shaped by the same legal framework that the court has now undermined. Every jurisdiction where district lines have been drawn with an eye toward ensuring that Black and Latino voters have a meaningful opportunity to elect representatives of their choice will now be operating in a far more uncertain legal environment. Decades of progress in building diverse and representative local governments could be rolled back if aggressive politicians choose to redraw those maps without the legal constraints that previously limited their options. The same concerns apply to Latino voters and communities who have also relied heavily on the Voting Rights Act's protections to secure representation in Congress and in state and local governments across the country. The Southwest in particular has a long history of Latino communities being systematically underrepresented in legislative bodies, despite making up large portions of the population in their states and regions. The legal tools that allowed advocates to challenge that underrepresentation have now been significantly weakened, and the communities most dependent on those tools will be watching closely to see how elected officials and legislative majorities respond to the newly permissive environment the court has created. For all the gravity of the legal developments in Washington, it is worth stepping back to look at the broader political landscape that provides the context for these fights. Reporting from Ohio offers a revealing window into the state of American politics at this moment. And what it shows is a country in genuine flux in ways that complicate simple narratives about permanent Republican dominance or inevitable Democratic decline. Ohio is a useful place to take the political temperature of the country because it has traveled an instructive arc over the past decade. For most of American political history in the modern era, Ohio was the quintessential swing state, the bellwether that politicians and analysts watched closely because it had a remarkable habit of going with the winner in presidential elections. That changed with Donald Trump. His coalition, built heavily on working-class white voters in the manufacturing belt and rural areas of the state, turned Ohio from a competitive purple state into a reliably red one. Trump won Ohio by comfortable margins in both 2016 and 2020, and his margins only grew larger in 2024. In the most recent election, Trump carried 81 of Ohio's 88 counties. That is not a swing state. That is a red state. And yet, as the 2026 midterm cycle approaches, something interesting is happening in Ohio. Democrats believe, and some independent analysts agree, that the state could actually be competitive again, not just in congressional races, but in statewide contests for governor and United States Senate. After a decade and a half of Republican dominance at the state level, Democrats are talking seriously about breaking through. That kind of turnaround does not happen through organic demographic change alone. It requires persuasion. It requires former Trump voters to reconsider, and there is genuine evidence that some of them are doing exactly that. The Mahoning Valley in northeastern Ohio is one of the most instructive places to look at these dynamics. This is a gritty, blue-collar, union-dense region that was reliably Democratic for generations. Towns like Youngstown were built on steel and manufacturing, and their politics were shaped by the labor movement and the Democratic Party's historical identification with working people. That changed significantly in the Trump years. The Mahoning Valley was one of the places where Trump's message about trade, manufacturing, jobs, and economic nationalism resonated most powerfully with working-class voters who had watched their communities hollowed out by decades of deindustrialization. Many of those voters made a deal with Trump. They gave him their support, and he promised them an economic revival. Chris Anderson, the Mahoning County Democratic Party chairman, is blunt about what he thinks happened. He believes those voters got conned. That is an easy thing for a Democratic official to say, but Anderson points to something more concrete than partisan spin. When asked what is actually different now compared to previous cycles, he invites skeptics to drive around Mahoning County and look for Trump signs, MAGA flags, or red hats, the kinds of visible displays of enthusiasm that were genuinely everywhere just a few years ago. They are much harder to find now. That is not conclusive proof of a political shift, but it is a signal worth noting. The most emotionally and politically charged location in this story is Lordstown, Ohio, home to Local 1112 of the United Auto Workers and the site of the former General Motors assembly plant that was the symbolic center of Trump's manufacturing revival promises. General Motors had been making cars in Lordstown for 5 decades, and the plant supported thousands of good-paying union jobs that were the economic backbone of the surrounding communities. In 2019, GM closed the Lordstown plant, a decision that devastated the region and that Trump had explicitly promised to prevent. He had told workers not to sell their homes and had assured them that good jobs were coming back. When the plant closed anyway, it was a significant blow to Trump's credibility with the very workers he had claimed to champion. What happened next is a complicated story that reflects the gap between political promises and economic reality. Foxconn, the Taiwanese electronics manufacturing giant, announced plans to build a new factory on the former GM site, billing it as a major step in Trump's manufacturing renaissance. The factory was built, but it is largely idle now, operating far below its promised capacity as Foxconn continues to work through questions about what it will actually produce there and how many workers it will actually employ. The factory is not unionized, which is a significant point of contention for UAW members who see union jobs, not just any jobs, as the measure of whether the manufacturing revival is real. Meanwhile, another project has taken shape nearby. Ultium Cells, a joint venture between General Motors and South Korea's LG Energy Solution, built an electric vehicle battery manufacturing facility in the Lordstown area. This was presented as another piece of the region's economic comeback. But the timeline of that factory has also been rocky. Bob Swagger, who leads the campaign committee at Local 1112, notes that as of early 2025, all production at Ultium Cells had been shut down, and roughly 460 workers had been laid off at the start of January with no clear timeline for when production would resume and those jobs would return. Swagger and his fellow union members find themselves in a complicated position when it comes to Trump's second term. The UAW endorsed Kamala Harris in the 2024 presidential election, but a significant portion of the union's membership voted for Trump regardless of the official endorsement, a reflection of how deep the cultural and economic appeal of Trump's message runs in places like Lordstown. At the same time, the union endorsed Trump's tariff policies, which were supposed to protect American manufacturing jobs by making imported goods more expensive and giving domestic manufacturers a competitive advantage. The UAW's logic was straightforward. If tariffs bring manufacturing back to the United States, that means more union jobs. Has that actually happened? Swagger says not that he is aware of. The macroeconomic data bears out his skepticism. Manufacturing employment is up slightly in some recent monthly reports, but the overall picture since Trump returned to the White House is one of decline rather than growth. Total manufacturing employment across the country is down approximately 80,000 jobs compared to when Trump took office at the start of his second term. American auto manufacturing specifically has shed roughly 25,000 jobs since the beginning of Trump's second term. These are not the numbers of a manufacturing renaissance. They are the numbers of an industry under pressure. The human stories connected to these statistics are worth dwelling on because they help explain the political dynamics that analysts are observing. Mark Scani is one of those stories. Scani served in the United States military overseas, including deployments to Kosovo, Iraq, and Afghanistan. After leaving the Army, he found himself drawn to the Tea Party movement and then to Trump, pulled by a combination of economic anxiety, cultural grievance, and a sense that the political establishment had failed ordinary Americans. He describes his political evolution during that period with a degree of self-awareness that is not always common in political conversations. He acknowledges that he allowed himself to become very right-wing, using the word radicalized to describe his trajectory before catching himself and softening the term. He is not proud of where he went during that period, but he also does not deny it. What changed for Scani was a gradual process of political reassessment that culminated in 2020. He now calls himself an independent and is backing Democratic candidates in the 2026 midterms. His reasons are less about economic policy and more about what he describes as the threat that Trump and the MAGA movement pose to democratic institutions and the rule of law. His military service gave him a particular reverence for the Constitution and for the norms that hold American democracy together, and he believes those things are genuinely at risk in a way they were not in previous administrations. Further south, along the Ohio River in Portsmouth in Scioto County, another former Trump voter is having second thoughts, and his reasons are both personal and political. Dale King opened his gym in Portsmouth 16 years ago after returning home from 2 tours of duty in Iraq. His office is filled with military memorabilia, the accumulation of a life defined in significant part by his service to the country. When a visitor looks at those mementos and asks about the current geopolitical moment, King's emotions are close to the surface. The thing that has pushed him away from Trump in 2026 is the Iran situation, the possibility of another major military conflict in the Middle East just 20 years after he was fighting there himself. King describes the experience of watching a potential new war with Iran develop as scratching a scab, reopening wounds that veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts are still working to heal. He is not a pacifist, and he is not naive about the threats that the United States faces. He describes himself as strongly pro-military and deeply committed to the country's defense, but he draws a sharp distinction between taking security threats seriously and being what he calls flippant about war. He believes the current administration is not treating the gravity of potential military conflict with the seriousness it deserves, and that conviction is enough to push him from supporting Trump to voting for Democrats in the midterms. King has been talking to friends and fellow veterans across the country, and he believes his experience is not unique. He says the shine is coming off the Trump presidency for a lot of people who supported him enthusiastically in previous cycles. They are beginning to see, in his telling, the true nature of who Trump is, as opposed to the version of Trump that he presented on the campaign trail. Looking at the political map that Ohio Democrats have to navigate, the scale of the challenge comes into sharp relief. Trump winning 81 of 88 counties is an extraordinary level of dominance in a large and diverse state. That is not the kind of political environment where simply turning out the Democratic base more efficiently or waiting for demographics to shift is going to be enough. Democrats need to actually persuade people who voted for Trump, sometimes multiple times, to vote differently. The voters like Dale King and Mark Scanney who are reconsidering their support are real. But the question is whether there are enough of them to change statewide outcomes. The economic argument that Ohio Democrats are making is centered on a simple but powerful observation. In more than half of Ohio's 88 counties, the cost of living is rising faster than wages. The price of energy, housing, and groceries is running ahead of what workers are taking home. That is not a talking point tailored to progressive primary voters. That is a kitchen table reality that cuts across party lines and resonates with exactly the kinds of working class voters who swung to Trump in the first place. If Democrats can make the 2026 midterms a referendum on whether people's economic lives have actually improved under Trump's second term, they believe they have a genuine argument to make. The fact that Ohio is even being discussed as a competitive state after a decade of reliable Republican dominance is itself significant. It speaks to a broader national dynamic in which Trump's second term is producing a level of public discontent that even favorable electoral maps cannot fully insulate Republicans from. The first term of any president is typically followed by midterm elections in which the opposing party performs well as voters use the midterms to express frustration or send a message. Trump's second term is following a similar pattern, but potentially with greater intensity because of the specific controversies, policy reversals, and governance failures that have accumulated. The connection between these political dynamics and the Voting Rights Act fight is not incidental. Critics of the Republican legal strategy argue that the aggressive push to weaken voting rights protections is a direct response to the cracking of the MAGA coalition. If you are a political party that knows your support is slipping in key states like Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Georgia, and you see the demographic writing on the wall in states like Arizona, North Carolina, and Nevada, then winning through persuasion and broad coalition building is one path forward. Another path is making it structurally harder for the voters who are least likely to support you to cast ballots and have their votes translated into representation. The Voting Rights Act has long been one of the primary legal barriers to that second approach. Its weakening removes a significant obstacle. But there is a potential irony in this strategy that Democrats are beginning to articulate more clearly. The Voting Rights Act protections that Republicans are celebrating the weakening of were a double-edged sword. Yes, they required the preservation of majority-minority districts in southern states, districts that produced Black and Latino representation, but those same kinds of protections also constrained what Democrats could do in states they control. In heavily blue states like Illinois, California, and New York, Democrats have historically had to preserve majority-minority districts when drawing congressional and legislative maps, even when doing so sometimes worked against maximizing Democratic seat totals from a purely partisan perspective. If those protections disappear nationally, Democrats in blue states gain more freedom to draw maps in ways that could cost Republicans seats in Congress and in state legislatures. Whether Democrats would actually embrace that kind of counter-gerrymandering strategy is an open and contested question within the party. There is a genuine tension between the commitment to fair representation, including minority representation, and the desire to use every available tool to counter what many Democrats see as an illegitimate Republican power grab.